I've been on this stage on many occasions, but usually I'm seated in a cozy armchair, either interviewing an exorcist or trying to moderate between David French and Sohrab Ahmari, for those of you who follow political debates. So it's exciting to be here under my own capacity to say anything that I want without having to ask anyone any questions at all. So I'm really grateful in particular for that opportunity. I am, in all sincerity, incredibly grateful to be here with all of you. It's a little bit daunting to be brought in front of a room full of actual Catholic scientists as someone who, like all newspaper columnists, postures as an expert on 17 different subjects over the course of 18 different weeks. And so one of the subjects that I occasionally write about is science and religion, and I posture as someone who knows to some degree what I'm actually talking about, but here I am in a room full of people who really do know what they're talking about and might, pass a certain kind of harsh judgment on my attempt to claim similar sort of distinctive knowledge. But so I'm not, in the interests of sort of expressing that modesty, going to offer you some sort of rah-rah boosterish talk about the fundamental compatibility of religious faith, Catholic faith, and the scientific project. I think that all of you probably in your own personal and professional lives have even stronger reasons to believe in that compatibility than I have as a layman and amateur looking over your work and benefiting from it. I'm just going to briefly offer a sketch of what the book that did in fact say some very nice things about one of Dr. Barr's books, what that book is trying to accomplish, and then say something more general about the cultural moment in which we find ourselves and how it might sort of implicate all of your vocations and sort of offer a certain kind of encouragement for the work that all of you do, because I think it is a very interesting cultural moment that we find ourselves in right now. So the book itself comes out of a reading of what that cultural moment is. So we've lived for the last 15 or 20 years in the Western world, and especially in the United States of America, in a period of pretty rapid secularization and pretty rapid decline in certainly religious affiliation, if religious practice has declined less dramatically. And this is kind of, in sociological terms, a sort of aftershock of the larger shock that followed the 1960s. So you had sort of a wave of secularization from the 60s through, let's say, the early 1980s, then a kind of partial recovery that in Catholic terms we can think of as the John Paul II era, but obviously it has sort of evangelical Christian analogs. And then somewhere starting in the early 2000s, you had another drop-off. And that's the context in which I've spent almost all of my professional life as a Catholic journalist. I became a Catholic as a teenager, sort of in the waning days of John Paul II's pontificate, but I was living in Boston as a student at Harvard University, or as the Trump administration likes to call it, public enemy number one. Apologies to some of you. Apologies to myself. I don't know. But I was living there when the sex abuse crisis broke in Boston. And so in certain ways, from that moment on, my entire adult professional life has sort of been shadowed by intimations of sort of Christian crisis, Christian crack up, Catholic scandal, and Catholic decline. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I think something has pretty clearly shifted. I would not describe us as living in a moment of religious revival. I would say that we're living in a moment when American culture is kind of considering whether to have a religious revival. And part of what is driving that consideration is the fact that you have a lot of people in the culture, especially young people in Generation Z, whose experience of religion is just completely different from the experience of lapsed or disillusioned or half-hearted Catholics and Christians from, let's say, 1960 through 2000, by which I mean that many of these people have absolutely no experience of religion whatsoever. It's not their parents were not Christmas and Easter Catholics. They didn't go to Sunday school for a couple years. The story of Cain and Abel would not ring any bells with them. I once sat at dinner at a lobster shack on the coast of Maine with the daughter of a very nice secular friend of ours, and my mother was talking to the daughter, probably a 10-year-old girl, and in the course of the conversation, it became clear that she did not know what an angel was. And it's sort of an extreme anecdote because most Americans do know what angels are, right? But a representative one in the sense that there's all of this sort of cultural experience of religion and cultural memory of religion that a lot of people growing up today don't have at all. But what that also means is, one, they don't have any of the baggage associated with religion seen as a kind of punitive and oppressive force in people's lives. A lot of the trends and developments that disillusion people with religious faith sort of happened before their adult consciousness was fully formed. And they also have the experience of actually living in the landscape that the kind of new atheist generation of public intellectuals confidently predicted would be a landscape of, sort of greater enlightenment and happiness and peace, all of which was supposed to ensue once we removed religion from the social and cultural equation. I think everyone who looks around at America in the early 2020s can see that that prophecy has not been vindicated in any way, shape, or form. And young people coming of age in this environment especially have strong reasons to recognize that a world without sort of clear metaphysical horizons, a world that struggles to give basic answers to questions of who human beings are and what we're here for and why is life worth living, is not some sort of blissful scientific and rationalist utopia, but much more of a darkling plain where ignorant armies clash by night, and where the claims of religion are suddenly a lot more interesting than maybe they were to people who came of age in a world where religion was more taken for granted. So I ended up writing this particular book, not exclusively, but in a particular way, sort of addressing myself to readers who find themselves in that kind of position, interested in religion and religious ideas without having any clear sense of what is religion anyway? Why might someone be religious? And people who carry with them what I think is sort of the strongest enduring bias of a secular or secularized society, which is the sense that it might be nice if religion were true, but in order to believe that it's actually true, you have to give up on many of the most important fundamentals of the modern technological and scientific landscape that we all inhabit. So the first part of the book, which is the part that draws the most on the kind of work that some or many of you have done in your own professional careers, and that rips off mercilessly from modern physics and ancient faith, among other books, is basically an attempt to sort of, one way to think about it is that it's an attempt to take St. Paul's comment in the letter of the Romans, right, that even before the Christian revelation came along, there was more than enough evidence. I'm paraphrasing St. Paul here, forgive me, but there was more than enough evidence, right, to convince people that God actually existed. So they had no excuse not to believe, even before the revelation of Jesus Christ. And I'm basically saying, well, what does that argument look like in sort of 21st century life, given what we know or think we know, given what realities confront us in the world as we experience it? What would it mean to sort of make St. Paul's initial case before you get to the question of revelation, right? Before you get to the question of which particular faith tradition should you participate in? Where has God most fully revealed himself? Just that basic level of what should an ordinary, reasonable person sense or think or understand about the universe. And so the attempt that the book makes is to basically say, not that there is one slam dunk argument that absolutely proves once and forever the existence of God. There certainly may be, and I know there are probably some Thomists in the room who are raising their hand even now to say that they have it, but I'm not quite philosophically competent enough to make that kind of intensive case. Instead, the book basically tries to sort of portray reality as offering, in particular, and these are not the only lines you could pursue, but three converging lines, three converging fact patterns for which a religious perspective on the world, a perspective that says mind precedes matter, that there is intentionality behind the cosmos, and that intentionality had us in mind in some important way, that human beings exist for a reason and are part of the purpose of the cosmos, even if we don't know fully what that purpose is. That is a more parsimonious explanation for these converging lines than are the materialist and atheist alternatives. So one of those lines, again, follows arguments that Stephen, among others, have made around the basic evidence for order and harmony and mathematical beauty, and perhaps even cosmic fine-tuning in the physical structure and nature of reality. That's sort of one line that I try and pursue. The second line starts with the mystery of human consciousness and sort of teases out a lot of debates around the hard problem of consciousness and what, how we should think about the sort of materialist versus non-materialist explanations for consciousness, but ends by trying to sort of link the mystery of consciousness to the overarching order in the universe by talking about the extent to which it is remarkable that our consciousness is capable of penetrating and understanding that order, which, to the extent that there's sort of a particular philosophical come scientific argument around these questions that I'm particularly drawn to, it tends to be that one. The sort of mystery of how our consciousness can get so far, and we can get quite impressively far in actually unlocking the secrets of the universe in which we find ourselves, right? Which, to my mind, suggests the structure of the universe suggests some kind of mind at the start of things, the fact that our minds can work their way upward toward that cosmic order and structure suggests some kind of relationship between the originating mind and our consciousness. And then finally, I turn a bit away from, although I don't think it's completely away from the more scientific questions, and talk about the persistence and resilience of mystical and supernatural and numinous experience in an allegedly disenchanted age. And my argument is that, again, while this is not amenable in the same way as other questions to laboratory study and certain forms of scientific hypothesis, it is nonetheless a remarkable and striking fact pattern that is not something that the typical materialist and skeptic would have predicted as something that would have in fact persisted once religious authority was removed. If you go back and read writers like David Hume and others in the late 18th century Enlightenment era, there's sort of a pretty clear expectation that, yes, if you get rid of religion, people will go on believing some kooky things about reality, but most of the belief in supernatural experience is just the result of people reading the Bible and being told they have to believe in these ancient legends, strip away that obligation to believe, and a lot of that stuff will fall away. And I think there's absolutely no evidence that that stuff, and there is a lot of that stuff, has fallen away at all. And in fact, there's a lot of areas where 19th and 20th century and early 21st century modernity has yielded more examples, more efflorescences of weird mystical experience, more examples of experiences that we can learn more about because of modern scientific advances. I do spend a little bit of time on the mystery of near-death experiences, among other subjects. But basically the claim is that this is, in a way, further evidence of that relationship that I think you can see between the possibility of a higher consciousness and our own consciousness, further evidence that if there is a higher consciousness, is in fact interested in us, right? So it's not just that we have reasons to believe that the universe was ordered and designed with something in mind. It's that we are given lots of reasons to believe that it was ordered and designed with us in mind. Now, in each of these cases, I think I would stress that it's not as if you can't come up with other hypothetical explanations for why we end up with the world that we have. My claim is more that the religious, Christian, ultimately Catholic explanation does a better job of explaining all of those features of reality in a relatively simple way, whereas what you find with materialism is a kind of rushing around from one area to another, piling up one set of explanations that are supposed to resolve this point, and then you need a completely different set of explanations to resolve the next point, and then those explanations end up in a certain kind of tension with one another. So yes, it is of course possible that the fine-tuning of our universe is explained by an infinite number or near infinite number of alternative universes that we can't see, taste, or touch. That could be. Okay, so we've piled up the multiverses over here, and now we have to explain consciousness. So we need to posit some kind of complex theory of emergence that has 16 parts that haven't quite been filled in yet. But, all right, we've done that, and maybe some elements of quantum theory. We need some more multiverses over here. Okay, so we've added some more. And then you get around to religious experience, and you've sort of, you've basically, in the consciousness debate, if you're, let's say, Daniel Dennett, you've tried to persuade everyone that consciousness is basically an illusion. There's, nothing important actually going on there. And then to explain mystical experience, suddenly the materialists start talking about the power of the Jungian unconscious and all of these levels of consciousness that are doing all these things that we can't understand. It seems to be slightly in tension with the reductionist view of consciousness in which nothing important is going on. And again, my claim is not that you can't put all of this together into something that could theoretically be true, but it just seems a lot less likely to be true than the simpler idea that evidence of intentionality, design, some kind of human relationship to cosmic purpose, some kind of sense that the cosmic purpose is interested in us, that just fits the facts in a simpler and clearer and more realistic way, and that the materialist in the early 21st century is increasingly in the position of a late-stage Ptolemaic theorist running around, sticking on really impressive, in some cases, epicycles to keep the whole system in order, but it seems increasingly less and less, or increasingly unlikely, that this complex and impressive system of moving parts is really describing reality itself. So that at least is a rough sketch of the argument that I make, and that's just the first third of the book, so covering a lot of ground, right? And then it gets a bit more into a little bit more of a kind of self-help model, where you're trying to sort of say to people who are ideally at least somewhat convinced by this argument, all right, well, having accepted this version of the Pauline theory of things, what do you do next, right? How would you actually enter into religious practice? How would you think about the diversity of religions? How would you think about particular problems and debates that are obviously unsettled in religious life? How would you think about debates about the problem of evil? How would you think about debates about sexuality? All of these things. And part of the claim there is that often in our culture and society, you have people who end up rejecting religion and religious ideas for what are ultimately secondary reasons, when there are still really excellent primary reasons to think that the religious perspective on reality is true. And I think that applies pretty strongly to debates around the problem of evil, which I certainly don't imagine myself presenting a slam dunk solution to. My claim is much more that it is entirely reasonable to debate the problem of evil, to treat it as an unresolved uncertainty about the full nature of God and human purpose and reality, but to do so in a context where you think, probably God exists, right? And that it seems to me is in fact quite true to the Jewish and Christian and ultimately Catholic tradition, where the Bible is not exactly short on people having arguments about theodicy, including arguments with God himself. That's a running theme in both the Old and New Testaments, right? That, but related to that is basically the claim that a lot of ideas and issues and arguments that people wrestle with and think they have to wrestle with outside of religion before they can enter into religion are in fact arguments and ideas and issues that you can and should continue to wrestle with inside religion once you've made the quite reasonable choice to actually come inside. So that's sort of the theme of the middle section of the book, and then the book ends with, a kind of straightforward pitch for the New Testament, the Gospels, and Christianity. So officially, the book is not a work of C.S. Lewis style pro-Christian polemic, but I acknowledge in the introduction that I'm obviously trying to sort of get there in the end. But how does this? Let me go from that sketch back to a view of the current moment, right? So the current moment offers us, I think, a landscape of, again, what you might call interesting possibility. And this is a diagnosis, but one that I think has been pretty strongly confirmed to me by my experience actually going out and promoting the book. Because once you write a book in this day and age, the days of the fancy book tour are mostly dead and gone, except for lovely invitations like this one. Mostly you go up to your attic and record podcasts, 6, 7, 18 per day, depending on your capacities. So I've done a lot of conversations, and many of these conversations have been with Catholics and evangelicals or non-Christian religious believers, but I've done quite a few conversations with non-believers, and I've actually ended up having a tough time getting people to challenge me directly from a kind of Dawkins, Dennett, sort of new atheist perspective. Now, probably that's because, the really serious atheists are oppressing all of you in academic departments and don't have time. No, I'm kidding. They're all wonderful colleagues, made in the image of God, but don't have time to traffic with the likes of newspaper columnists. I think that's there is probably some truth to that I am not actually, in doing the journalistic podcast circuit, always engaging with the absolute highest levels of the human intellect, which is, I'm casting aspersions on myself here, to be clear, not my interlocutors. But I do think I can get a pretty good sense from that circuit of where the kind of, lay, intelligent, liberal, secular perspective is right now. And I think that perspective right now is in a place of great uncertainty about what's going on in the universe, what a human being is, where human civilization is going. And this uncertainty is not just religious. The religious uncertainty is manifestation of something that is also present in politics, and sort of a general deep uncertainty among people who were very confident about the arc of history 15 years ago, about where history is actually taking us. But the religious uncertainty is manifest in people being, well, there's a lot of variation, right? I presented my own argument as one of converging lines, and what you see when you go out and talk about these issues with people who are not themselves believers is that usually one line or another will seem quite persuasive, but one of the other lines will seem totally implausible, right? So I'll have one conversation with people who will say, all of this, all of these questions about sort of the physical ordering of reality and, the sort of Platonic forms of mathematics and the evidence for fine-tuning, all of that's very interesting, but you lose me as soon as you start talking about miracles or the supernatural. And then you'll have people for whom it's the opposite. I had, one young woman stand up at a book talk and say, I was really disappointed that you were trying to argue that science and reason can point us towards God, because what I have found in religion is a kind of escape from the punishing tyranny of Western modes of reasoning, right? There are people who want the numinous and the supernatural, but don't want to think that religion is part of a kind of reasoning structure about reality. You have people who will, who will basically sort of agree with 80% of your premises, but will recoil from the word God, right? It's like, do you have to call it God? Can't we call it something else, right? You'll have people in that position. And then you'll have people whose position is just a kind of resistance to religious specificity, right? The idea that, that any particular religion has enough going for it that you should commit to that religion in particular. But meanwhile, these same people are really eager to tell you about their experience taking ayahuasca and how it changed their perspective on reality. And I mean this sincerely. Like, this is not this is a conversation that I've had on more than one occasion, right? That's a really interesting landscape in which one might operate as a journalist, as a public intellectual, but also just as someone whose academic work has implications for how people who are not themselves scientists and not themselves academics think about the nature of reality, what we can know about reality, and what our knowledge of reality can tell us about what deeper structure might lie beyond the universe, and how that might relate to the everyday ordering of human life. And I think that it should give, and this is, I guess you could see this as a pep talk. It's a pep talk, right? It should give people in your position a certain kind of confidence that this is a moment when the Catholic scientist is less likely to be seen as some sort of eccentric or curious figure, sort of holding on to some outmoded idea in a world that has passed them by, or any kind of modernist secular cliche like that, and is more likely to be seen as someone who holds both the formal wisdom that our age sort of recognizes and respects, the mantle of scientific authority and all the rest of it, but also has a kind of secret knowledge that people are looking for, even if they aren't sure about what they're looking for, that itself helps make sense of a lot of unanswered questions that hover over the formal paradigms of official knowledge, right? And certainly, I think, as a layperson who has all kinds of limitations on my own understanding, but has in fact spent a fair portion of my adult life reading in the religion and science debates, the materialism versus supernaturalism debates, I think there should be a lot of confidence for people in the position of the Catholic scientist that even if you're not, about to win people over 100% to your own theological position through rational argument and the invocation of, scientific knowledge and scientific authority, the position that is most diametrically opposed to you is really a quite weak position, whose weakness is evident, even if people aren't sort of saying it fully, is quite evident to lots and lots of smart, educated lay people who are, again, not themselves committed to Christianity or any other faith, right? I think that my personal opinion, right, is that for all kinds of reasons, not just the ones that I gestured at in my sketch of my own book, but others as well, the religious scientist, the scientist who thinks that they are working in and trying to understand a universe made by a capital M mind, a benevolent deity, the religious scientist has always had an intellectual advantage over the skeptical materialist atheist scientist, in that there are important ways in which the religious scientist's understanding of what they're doing and why it makes sense and why it works just makes a lot more sense than the skeptic and materialist perspective on why science works and why we should take it seriously and lend its claims authority. I think that's always been true, but I think there has been a real cultural shift, and we'll see how long it lasts. And how long it lasts, I think, depends on the opportunity that all of us make out of it. But I think there's a real cultural shift towards an awareness of the weakness of materialist alternatives to religion, and the potential, at the very least, the potential for religious arguments to be seen as something other than a curiosity, something other than a claim made against the overwhelming evidence, and something closer to what they've been viewed as throughout most of human history by, let's be honest, most serious and intelligent people, which is a perspective on the world that just makes sense. So on that note, I'll stop rambling. Thank you for listening. Again, a real honor to be here. And it's 8:05, and our agreement was that I would just take questions for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then at a time chosen by my host, he will say, take 2 more questions, and that will be it. And then we'll turn to the next phase of the evening. So maybe I'll rove around the stage. Questions, comments in the form of a question. Yes.
When you were young.
He is here.
Not that you're that old now, right? No. When you were like 10 years old.
Yes.
When did you first encounter this sort of problem with science and religion, and how did you respond to it back then? I mean, did you hear people saying that you had to be an atheist to be a scientist, and how did you relate to that?
So, this is a question about my upbringing and when I encountered the science versus religion tension. So I had not a curious religious upbringing. This is America. There are no curious, there are only religious upbringings, no curious ones. But so I grew up in Southern Connecticut. My parents had gone to Yale and Stanford. My dad was a lawyer. We were Episcopalians, sort of lukewarm Episcopalians when I was little. And then for complicated reasons got pulled into the worlds of charismatic and Pentecostalist Christianity. And I spent a certain amount of time as a kid having a kind of odd double life where on the weekdays I went to sort of nice meritocratic secular liberal schools, and then on the weekends I went and watched my overeducated parents speak in tongues. So that was my background, and I didn't have those experiences myself. And these were like intense, it was a kind of environment where, again, in this audience, I'm sure at least some people are familiar with these kind of experiences, but, the kind of thing where the woman who was the focus of the faith healing services that we started going to would just sort of walk around the room and point to someone, and they would fall over and remain in a prone position having a religious experience for the next 20 minutes, something like that, right? So it was a very intense landscape, but when she pointed to me, I didn't have an intense religious experience, and that was true of other environments, more sort of communal revivalist environments we were in as well. And there's probably a scenario where that instilled in me a lifelong skepticism, or a scenario where I became a hardcore Calvinist, but convinced that I was damned from the beginning. But fortunately, neither of those happened. Instead, I had this baseline assumption that this was a real phenomenon. It was a part of reality that was poorly explained by my secular environment. And it was a phenomenon that could be reasoned about. So, I was sort of like William James, right? Like wandering around charismatic Christianity, taking notes, right? Like, what is happening in this experience here? And that has sort of carried with me. It's part of why, just in this book, I put together the sort of spiritual, experiential arguments together with the scientific arguments, because I think you can, in fact, reason, not in identical ways, but reason about them both. Anyway, that's not an answer to your question, but that's sort of a frame for thinking about like the science versus religion stuff. So probably when I was first aware of these debates, it would have been, we would have still been sort of inside a bit those kind of worlds, which were more, they weren't fundamentalist, but they were, they were closer to fundamentalism, right, in certain ways, in their perspective. So I do remember, like, in an AP biology class, having an evangelical friend who had read, is it Philip Johnson, Darwin on Trial, right? And like those arguments sort of floated up in that science class, right? And I was sort of more on the evangelical kid's side against my very smart atheist AP biology teacher. But I don't think I don't think I sort of developed any kind of formal theory before my sort of coming into religious intellectual self-consciousness probably came, this is like literally true, when my parents were First Thing subscribers, so probably some of the earliest articles that I read about faith and science might have been written literally by Stephen Barr, right? So like that's, here I am today, sorry. a misspent youth. But yeah, I would say coming into sort of intellectual self-consciousness was sort of overlapped with our family ending up becoming Catholic, and sort of coming in at this moment, sort of again, the end of the John Paul II pontificate, where, I just feel like I read a lot of authors who had a lot of confidence in the compatibility of faith and science at that moment. But then I went, to college and sort of entered into entered more deeply into these kind of debates. And I guess like you, not as a debater, but as a reader, and I guess my impression as someone like in my early 20s would have been, the Christians, the religious interpreters of science seem to have good arguments, but there's so many smart materialists that there's got to be something pretty potent there. And I feel like I sort of, that was sort of the closest that assumption of a potency to the materialist case was the closest I got to really questioning. I don't think I ever really questioned, but I certainly had doubts and a sense of okay, there's so much weight of authority behind materialism, that there must be something powerful there. So that would have been my view at age 25. And my view at age 45 is that actually there's a lot less there than meets the eye. And I've sort of, but it's hard, but of course in human psychology, it's hard to separate these things. Like having that weird religious childhood did sort of set as a baseline, something weird is going on in the universe, right? That's just an idea that I carry in my head that I will never get rid of for as long as I live, even if tomorrow, I read the most brilliant atheist materialist critique of religion and science's compatibility, it wouldn't do away with that initial grounding experience. So that did undoubtedly shape my reception of the debate to some degree. That was a long-winded answer. Sorry. Yes.
You're in a position where, hopefully I can speak loud when I'm heard. You're in a position where you have, with New York Times, correct?
Yes.
So although numbers are declining dramatically, nonetheless, you can reach quite a broad audience now. I dare say most in here are educators in academia. So I dare say that most of your students are in a Catholic institution. So my question would be, how could we, as those who are convinced that there is something more than just the material, how could we have an impact on, as you put it, we're at this point in our cultural, societal, Western culture, Europe, North America, Africa seems to be doing fine, but what could we do to kind of tip this balance in the right direction toward, yes, there's not a real conflict, and yes, there is a God who loves us, died for us?
I mean, I think it's going to depend to some degree on what you feel to be your own vocation and the extent to which you see sort of public, slightly scratchy throat, treating public argument on those questions as part of your academic work. I think there are some people for whom it's natural to sort of take a step outward from their particular academic work and sort of talk about the implications of that work for larger questions about reality itself. But then there are people for whom that's not a natural thing to do, and thank you so much. And not something that in Christian terms they're necessarily called to do. And for people in that position, I would say the answer is more about the local and personal and institutional, right? And again, it's different if you're in a Catholic institution versus a non-Catholic institution, but most people, not everybody here, but I would assume most people who are Catholic scientists working in scientific fields are operating in a landscape where they are distinctive and unusual. And being distinctive, being sort of aware of your own distinctives, aware of your unusual status, and trying to leverage that and in a way advertise that instead of effacing it and sort of minimizing it, I think is the most important way to think about that work, right? That it's like, you are a professor of physics or geology or whatever else at a major public university. Like, do your students know you're Catholic? Not that you're proselytizing them, but do they know you're Catholic? Do your colleagues know you're Catholic? Do you present as someone who is sort of serenely confident? Sorry. Forgive me. As you project as someone who is serenely confident in the compatibility of faith and reason, or as someone who is sort of, for whom that's something that is a view that's held defensively or is privatized and so on, right? I think a spirit of, obviously, again, there's sort of, every case is going to be different, but a spirit of sort of personal and intellectual confidence, figuring out how to project a spirit of personal intellectual confidence in the reasonable synthesis of science and religion in the immediate intellectual and academic sphere you find yourself in, that's the basic ideal. Yeah, sorry.
Quick follow-up with me on that. If this is not just an intellectual exercise on our parts, but in fact we are convinced that as academicians, scientists, or whatever, strain or whatever, that there is no conflict, and if we're members of a Catholic society, I would say the Great Commissions would compel us. If we're not going to stay lukewarm, and Jesus said, if you're lukewarm, Revelations, I'll speak you out of my mouth. So I don't want to sound too preachy on a high horse, but I think if we're here, we really are called to live that life and to let our students know, let our coworkers, let whomever, in whatever way that, yes, we do believe there's no conflict, and even more interested than the conflict, that the two go hand in hand. The two wings, was that Aquinas? Two wings that give flight to the human mind.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree. I think, though, that there is a balance, right? So I live with this reality in my life as a newspaper columnist, right? Where my job is to write, I'm a Catholic. My job is to write about, my primary job is to write about politics and society, sometimes religion, sometimes my own church, in a way that explains the world it explains what's actually going on in the world to people who often strongly disagree with me, right? And that, that means that you are not like, I'm not like doing Catholic witness all the time, right? If I write a column about Elon Musk's feud with Donald Trump, I'm not going to put in, at the bottom, by the way, this shows the action. Actually, these days I probably would put in something about how this shows the action of providence in history, right? But that gets to an important thing, which is that like the moment that you find yourself in and the cultural landscape also matters. I've been at the Times for 16 years, right? And I've written about religion and all that time. Everyone who reads the newspaper knows that I'm a practicing Catholic and so on. I'm not hiding that in any way. But the way I've written about these issues has changed as the world has become, let's say, a little weirder, and as the culture has seemed more receptive, right? And, if you read some of my columns about Christianity at the height of the Catholic sex abuse crisis, they're not going to be like chest beating and triumphalist, right? Because you're writing into a moment of failure in your own tradition that has to be reckoned with and so on, right? And so, and that also applies in personal relationships, right? When I think about people who I have known, who I've been friends with, who've become Catholic, 80% of the time, it's someone who completely surprises me or mostly surprises me, right? It's not the person I was sitting arguing with about the nature of free will or something late into the night in college. It's the guy who was, watching a football game while that was going on and sort of half listening to it, who, ends up as a Catholic, and, the other guy, we won't talk about what happened to him, but, his free will led him in other directions. So that, I just think that's like, you want to have a certain kind of evangelistic zeal, absolutely, but you also want to recognize that, like, one of the ways that you manifest the truth of Christianity is in sort of more basic ways. Like, it's like, oh, are you a good colleague, right? Like, it's interesting that the Christian in my department is also the best colleague, right? Like, that is no less in its way a form of Christian witness than, buttonholing your colleague and saying, have you looked more carefully into the hard problem of consciousness and its implications for mind-body dualism, right? Which, sometimes you want to do that too. I don't know. Anyway, so, yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I think I heard you say that your family, or your parents, went from being highly educated Catholics, highly educated individuals, Episcopalians, to evangelicals and then Catholicism.
Very roughly, yeah.
That's quite a spread. Can you comment on that? How did that happen?
I mean, you'd have to ask Almighty God. No, the simplest. So, first of all, while my parents were always Christians, I would not say that they were raised Christian, and they weren't like Christian intellectuals, right? When I was 6 years old, they were mainline Protestants whose parents had raised them as mainline Protestants, right? So it's not like they had this sort of fully fledged Christian worldview at that point. It was more that they had a kind of inherited Christian faith, and then we were pulled into these, these sort of worlds that were sort of foreign to the intelligentsia because of experience. Because my mother had some chronic illnesses and did some various things for them, as you do when you have chronic illnesses, and she had a friend who said, oh, why don't you come to a faith healing service where this woman named Grace, and was literally Grace, prays for sick people. And they had experiences there that were not on offer in, the local Episcopal church, that seemed to be experiences of an ultimate reality. And when you have those experiences, even if they're happening in a landscape that doesn't have some strong intellectual superstructure around them, you naturally want to stay there and be there for a while. So that, it really was just a kind of experiential pull into Pentecostalist, and then from there to sort of some evangelical churches. And then the turn to Catholicism was a combination of and people in this room, not unfamiliar sense of like a desire for that intellectual superstructure, a sense that, okay, I've felt the presence of God in my life, but I would like to belong to a tradition that reasons about that presence and has 2,000 years of intellectual resources and so on. There was some of that. There was also, again, especially for my mother, a kind of mystical connection where it was like, that she had, this would be her story, not mine, but she found experiential commonalities, let's say, between the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament and things that she had experienced in Pentecostalist churches. So it was not about sort of the reasoning superstructure. It was about like feeling like, okay, this is the same God. For me, since I didn't have those experiences, it was more of like a great relief that, we were attending a church. Like the things that, some people reasonably complain about with Catholicism, it's like you go to Mass and nobody talks to you and everyone sits in the back and so on. At age 15, I was like, yes, we get to sit in the back. Nobody's going to talk to us. It's amazing. No one's going to put their hand on my shoulder and say, son, can you testify the Lord Jesus Christ has changed your life? You get to memorize the prayers. Memorize them. No one asks you to make up a prayer. Anyway, so obviously I had some of the conventional intellectual attractions to Catholicism, that nerdy young, what was mentioned in the introduction. I read Chesterton and so on, right? Like that was all there, and I had a certain kind of literary attraction. I thought I was going to be a novelist at one point, so I was, you read Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh and these kind of people. So I had that, but I did also have this sense of like relief in finding a kind of hierarchical and liturgical church, because as much as I enjoyed being William James, wandering around other people's religious experiences, that was not like, I was not getting something there that I have gotten more of in the Catholic faith. Sir.
You've talked a lot about a debate between science and religion. But in having a debate with another individual, there's a whole another layer that's not being talked about. Because if as a materialist atheist, I'm going to give up on that, that means I'm not in charge of my life. I'm not in charge of my morals. I'm not in charge. I'm not my own God. That's a big challenge for a lot of people. What's your sense of how important is that in the current landscape? Because we can win the intellectual argument about that science and religion are compatible. That's been pretty well established for a long time, but it doesn't take in the culture very well. It seems as though the personal cost of giving up on being comfortable with being materialist might just be too high for a lot of people, and they'd rather talk about the conflict between religion and science.
Yeah, I think that's right to some degree. I mean, the reality is there's just a lot of psychological variation in the human race, right? And you have some people who are going to be brought to religious belief by one set of arguments, and other people who are going to have certain kinds of resistances, personal resistance that no argument can necessarily overcome. I think the tendency in American culture, right, has been in the last, especially since the 60s, but this has deeper roots, is to a view that traditional religion is in tension with individualism, expressive individualism, a sort of, a kind of full selfhood that, like, traditional religion sort of oppresses the fulfillment of the true self. And that has materialist atheist forms, and it also has kind of new age spirituality forms, and sometimes those overlap, right? But I think both of those have been powerful psychological forces pushing against religious belief, in much like the way you suggest, right? The idea that, like, if you listen to, like, John Lennon's Imagine, right, which people love that song, and maybe they just love it because it's a good song in some musical level, but people also like, there is a relief in the idea of imagining that there's no heaven, clearly, for some people. A relief of, like, okay, the stakes, you're in charge of yourself and the stakes just aren't that high, right? You're not going to go to hell. You're also not going to go to heaven, but, lower stakes. Some people experience that as a sense of relief. I do, though, think that there are sort of movements in culture over time where a generation that comes of age in a period where religion seems strong and constraining is going to be more drawn in the direction you're describing, to feeling like, I can't give in to religion because then I'm putting myself back under constraint. But a generation that comes of age in an era when religion is weaker and not a constraining force, which is, I think, true outside of some pockets of society in the culture now, I think that generation is going to be more likely to feel the kind of, the terrible isolation of the godless universe. Above us, only sky. Maybe that seems appealing if, you feel like you've had a nun rapping at you, whatever the cliches of the pre-Vatican II church, right? Like, we're not always being watched by a harsh divinity. That's the release. But the next generation or the generation after that, it's like terrifying. Above us, always sky. There's nothing else. That's it. We're alone. And I feel like, again, this is somewhat impressionistic, but I think there's data behind it as well. I see a lot more of that among younger Americans today, and a lot less of a sense of, like, comfort in and confidence in the, sort of self-mastery in a purely material universe. I mean, there's also the issue that, again, sort of pushed to its logical conclusion, materialism dissolves that same self, right? It's like, okay, materialism gives you yourself alone, no God, but the deeper you go into materialism, the more the self evaporates, and you're just left with the material alone. And I think, again, there is a kind of generational process where ideas work themselves out in cultural consciousness, and people sort of, like, someone in Generation Z might realize that implication more fully than someone in the baby boom generation, just because of the context in which they're raised. So yeah, I think that remains a powerful impediment, but I think it may be less of one over the next 25 years than it was over the last 25. We'll have to see. So it's 8:30, so I'll take two more questions. So one from this side, sir.
Yeah, you represent, I think, an interesting experiment on the part of the New York Times, a bit of a countercultural voice in the heart of the Gray Lady. And I'm just wondering if there have been tensions or conflicts. How have you navigated being in the milieu of that particular institution?
I mean, I think I've had an advantage in that I was hired as an experiment, right? Like, I think the hardest task, and this just doesn't just apply to liberal institutions, conservative institutions as well. The hardest position is the person who is supposed to share the consensus of the place, but is rebelling against it. The heretic, right? But I was not hired to be a heretic. I was hired to be a non-believer, a dissenter, right? Someone to represent ideas that are outside the orthodoxies of liberalism. And to some degree, that I just think that has always given me a little bit more a sense of freedom, right? It's like, I'm disagreeing with certain shibboleths of liberalism. That's my job. That's why you hired me. And I think the Times overall has been very good about taking that seriously and saying, yes, that's why we hired you, and we want to support you in that endeavor. So I've been there for 16 years, and I would say the great majority of that time, that all of the tensions that I have felt have been in my relationship with my readers, not my relationship with my colleagues or my bosses, right? That it's more like, and the constraints, I feel like, how far can you go in making this point? Which issue are you not going to talk about here because it will cost you credibility over there? Most of that, in my own mind, is happening in this kind of dynamic interaction with the reader, not like a fear that my boss is going to say, I can't believe you said this, like, you have to write an apology or something next week. Now, have there been, we all lived through the year of our Lord 2020, and, where things were difficult in many institutions, things were difficult in the New York Times. You could, read about it on the internet and sort of imagine for yourselves some of the challenges of that period. So I'm not going to pretend that there have not been moments of challenge, but generally, I had a good relationship with the people I've worked with. I do think, not to claim that I am like some ideal colleague, but I do think I've gone a long way by being friendly and adaptable and doing what people ask me to do. Like, they asked me to start to run a podcast the last 6 months. I may live to regret that, but I did that. You say yes, right? You come from a place of yes. And that has generally served me well. And I do also sincerely think that, like, I started in 2009, and the big debates of 2009 were, the stimulus package and the great after the financial crisis, and then Obamacare. And it segued into the Obama-Mitt Romney election, and I just was not really well suited for that, that landscape. I was not someone who had incredibly intense views on healthcare reform. I have views because I had to have views, right? But that wasn't my set of strengths. The world we're in now, for better or worse, plays to my strengths a little bit more. And I think that's, when I write my next column on UFOs or something, I'm like, yeah, God put me in the right place at the right time. What can I say? We'll see if that, outlasts the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez administration. But for now, it's been a good experience overall. So, last question. Yes.
At the end of your talk, you said that a religious scientist approaches research from a standpoint that makes more sense than the materialist, atheistic viewpoint. Can you talk more about that?
Yes. This is not, I don't think, a novel argument, really, but the expectations built into the modern scientific project, going back to Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, and so on, are the expectations of a religious civilization, in which it is taken for granted that the universe is orderly and predictable and amenable to rational investigation because it has a rational mind behind it. Now, that idea has obviously slipped away from the scientific consensus for reasons that I don't actually have a sort of 100% certainty about why that is. I have a lot of different theories, but whatever theory you embrace, clearly we don't exist in that world anymore. But that perspective on reality still does make more sense out of the scientific project, why it works, why we should expect it to work, why we should expect sort of the delivery of new insights from further investigations, why we shouldn't just assume that, as the accidental byproduct of random processes. I think with those expectations, you should assume that you're going to hit some serious walls in your ability to understand the universe. And I think the religious and Christian perspective also assumes that you'll hit some walls at some point, right? Like, not that, we're not going to fathom the true nature of the Trinity on this side of eternity and so on, right? Like, it's not that Christianity says that every problem has a rational solution, but I think a Christian perspective sets the ceiling on what the human mind should be able to do and understand and figure out higher than a materialist perspective does. And it explains why science works in the first place better than a materialist explanation does. And that's before you even get deep into debates about whether under materialist premises you should be able to trust your reason at all, which is a sort of almost a separate category and line of argument. I don't even think you have to get into those debates. You can say that, a materialist can trust their reason, but should they trust it as far as modern science expects us to trust it and asks us to trust it and expects it to work? I think the answer is no. I think the religious believer should expect reason to work further than the materialist, even if the materialist has reasons to trust their reason in the first place. So that's the short answer. So on that note, I want to thank you all again. This has been a real pleasure to be an amateur among the experts, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.